Frayed Feathers explains Indigenous Youth Voices, a roadmap to the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 66. Last week, we learned about Call to Action number 66, and this week we're going to unpack the next steps in this process, which is to engage Indigenous youth across Canada to inform this work. This video will be split into 6 sections. Firstly, the vision for this work, the methodology, the themes of engagement, the youth perspective of reconciliation, the next steps, and my call to action to you. Let's jump into section 1. On November 30th, 2016, the Honorable Carolyn Bennett, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, appointed Andre Baer, Gabrielle Fayant, and Maytali Okalik as youth advisors to develop the national network called Indigenous Youth Voices. The mission for Indigenous Youth Voices, or IYV, is to build a network to advance the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action number 66. This network will consist of First Nations, Inuit, Métis youth leaders, organizations, movements, and grassroots initiatives. As a national network, IYV seeks to engage on Indigenous youth priorities on the terms and standards set by Indigenous youth. They envision a future where all Indigenous youth have their needs met and opportunities to thrive in all aspects of their lives. This means having a strong sense of belonging and purpose to contribute to the wellness of their communities and have equal responsibilities and rights as the original peoples rooted in language and culture. They recognize the need to balance the differing perspectives of Indigenous youth, as each community is going to have a separate idea of wellness, rights, and culture. Now let's start breaking down how they did it. Firstly, they had a main research question being, how can we advance TRC Call to Action number 66 in establishing multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver reconciliation programs and establishing a national network to share information and best practices? Their research was guided by 3 points based on Indigenous epistemologies. They are: holistic Indigenous knowledge systems are a legitimate way of knowing. Receptivity and relationship between researcher and participant is, or ought to be, a natural part of the research methodology. Collectively, as a way of knowing, assumes reciprocity to the community. They collected data from multiple sources, being phone, email, in-person, online cross-sectional survey, and community organization engagements, including a national gathering for Indigenous youth leaders. You can see on the screen right now all the organizations and groups that were engaged to inform this work. The approach of these dialogues was to take the lead from Indigenous youth who are already living and working in these communities. Let's break down the themes of engagement. This report organizes the engagement feedback into 2 categories, with 5 themes for each category. The first category is reflection on community strengths and challenges, the themes being culture and language, sense of community, resilience and determination, and community challenges and proposed solutions. With the second category being, what does reconciliation mean to Indigenous youth? Acknowledging the past, healing, improving relations, treaty and land rights, equity. Lastly, the advocates undertook a select literature review. In the description, you'll find a list of the 24 reports selected, and we'll come back to this in just a second. Now for the good part, unpacking the perspective of Indigenous youth to achieve reconciliation. For clarity, I'm going to put a text box of the theme for my talking points on screen. To reconcile, Indigenous youth must be empowered with education on the full extent of how colonialism affects Indigenous communities. Without this understanding, they cannot be leaders in an authentic and meaningful way. Young Indigenous leaders feel the responsibility to ensure future generations of their peers will not have to deal with the same trauma, community challenges, and search for identity as they did. Indigenous people learn our traditional teachings from elders, aunties, and uncles in the community, but they are healing from colonization too and are challenged to pass on their wisdom to the youth. The empowerment they feel when healing is the source of strength they pull from to carry their advocacy and community-building work forward. Themes from survey respondents range from collaboration and friendship, both with government and between First Nations, to more nuanced descriptions of respect, active engagement, listening, humility, and acknowledgement of historical injustices. The need for strong relations with the Canadian government to respect treaties, land rights, and autonomy of Indigenous peoples. The historical basis of Indigenous and settler relations is rooted in treaty, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. Indigenous youth connect equity and inclusivity to reconciliation because oppression and racism is a significant part of daily life for them. Directly and indirectly, Directly and indirectly, they experience this in the way people treat them. They feel there is a lack of understanding and awareness about their history and culture by non-Indigenous people. When we consider that the selected literature dates back as early as 1997, the year I was born, it demonstrates that Indigenous youth have been forced to repeat themselves about the same challenges for the past decades. And so, with engagements concluded, we begin working on the next steps. And as a reminder, Call to Action number 66 directs the federal government to establish multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation. And to do this, a meaningful and sizable investment from the government of Canada is going to be required into Indigenous communities. It's important to note that this report outlines the immediate next steps and the longer-term strategy to move forward on Call to Action number 66, and I will just be providing you a grand overview of those things. The Indigenous Youth Voices Network proposes 3 key elements: national gatherings, community outreach, and an integrated communication strategy. Similarly to the previous section, I'll put a text box of the element relative to my talking points. Firstly, these annual gatherings will bring Indigenous youth leaders across Canada to network about progress, barriers, and opportunities for their work. These gatherings will host workshops to support priority themes like public speaking, fundraising, grant writing, networking, etc. Secondly, ongoing outreach is needed to Indigenous youth, individuals, groups, and organizations to strengthen the relationships across the IYV. This will ensure youth have multiple ways they can be involved in reconciliation. Thirdly, a Canada-wide communication strategy to improve information flow across the IYV network, sharing successes in different communities and facilitating opportunities for collaborations. These next 3 are considered elements, but not the key elements. The IYV research team will focus on collecting, organizing, and disseminating existing research and conducting new research about Indigenous youth needs and priorities. Customized support to be offered to individual youth and grassroots groups to support their access to resources to turn their ideas into action. The Code of Ethics will be used as a framework for funding community-based youth organizations more equitably. They will develop a roster of Indigenous youth leaders across the IYV network to sit on the committee of panel for funders. This committee will inform the disbursement of any Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada funds having to do with Indigenous youth. To achieve the next steps in this report, a lot of work needs to be done. This report goes into depth about the next steps and the level of priority they need to be set at. For example, there's an actual section that says immediate next steps. For a more detailed summary and analysis of this report, subscribe for tomorrow's podcast. So last week, you chose a skill that you were open to teaching to a group of Indigenous youth. This week, my request for you is to connect your teachable skill to one of the themes outlined in the Indigenous youth perspective of reconciliation. I'll put them back up on the screen now. It's not important for your contribution to fit perfectly, but it needs to make sense. For example, if you're a person who has strong organizational skills, then you likely manage an email quite well and you understand what needs to be done for a project to meet its deadline. Well, when we look at the Indigenous themes, or the Indigenous youth themes for reconciliation, then we see that there's improved relations there. And when we consider that we love working with people who are efficient and senior leadership of organizations, governments, institutions want to work with those people, well, by you teaching your organization to a group of Indigenous youth, you're improving relations, and that contributes to reconciliation. Another example could be if you wanted to teach a recreational talent or skill, like hip-hop dancing. I would implore you to consider healing as a theme because this is about a search for identity. Not only for Indigenous youth, but just youth in general, it's important for them to engage with a variety of hobbies to learn what they like and dislike. And also, when we are passionate about a hobby, typically we engage with communities of people who are also passionate about said hobby. And so, even if you find yourself conducting a community engagement or something like that to share your exercise, just the act of gathering Indigenous youth for them to engage with each other and learn from each other and make friendships, that is working reconciliation too. And so even in the pursuit of trying to teach Indigenous youth and gathering them and being reciprocal in your approach, you are already working towards reconciliation. I hope that what I'm sharing with you today resonates with your commitment to reconciliation. My goal is twofold. Firstly, to show you that Indigenous reconciliation is not about the government of Canada making large funding allocations to Indigenous youth, but rather a cultural shift of Canadian society to accept that we all play a part in this. And secondly, that you can positively contribute to reconciliation. Miigwech.